The water on his back explodes. Dozens of tiny fountains leap off his spine at once, dancing across the surface for 3 full seconds, and he has not moved a single muscle. No splash from a tail, no thrash of legs, just his lungs pulsing beneath 11 feet of armored hide, and the water responding like it has been struck by something no human eye can see. Because it has. What just rippled across that river is a sound so low it cannot be heard. It can only be felt. And felt is exactly what every crocodile within 400 meters is about to do. Here is the paradox that should not exist. Crocodiles are supposed to be the silent ones, cold, patient, mute killers that communicate through nothing but ambush and stillness. That is the story most people carry into adulthood, built on 1,000 nature documentaries showing jaws snapping shut in silence. But the most successful seducer in the reptile world does not rely on scent or color or a single visible display. He sings in a register the human ear was never built to catch, and every female in range hears him as clearly as a drumbeat in her own chest. Today, we find out how a 500-pound predator built entirely for silence turns himself into the loudest thing in the river, using a sound you will never hear. For most of the year, a male Nile crocodile lives like a rumor. He holds a stretch of riverbank alone, submerged for hours at a stretch, his metabolism so slow he can go a year between meals if he has to. Outside the breeding season, he barely vocalizes at all. Territory is claimed by presence, not noise. Other crocodiles learn where the boundaries are the hard way, through a snapped tail or a raked flank, and then everyone keeps their distance. It is a solitary, wordless existence, built around conserving energy and avoiding conflict, which is exactly what makes the transformation that arrives with the first warm rains so strange. The same animal that spent 11 months saying nothing suddenly has something to say to every crocodile in the water, and he says it through his own rib cage. The display begins on the surface, in full view. He arches his back, lifts his head and tail clear of the water until his body forms a shallow crescent, and draws in a breath that swells his throat and chest visibly outward. Then he holds it. For a heartbeat, nothing happens. Then, the water above his lungs starts to jump. Researcher Adam Britton, who has spent decades studying crocodilian behavior in the field, describes standing near a bellowing male and feeling the pressure wave travel through the water before any sound reaches the air. That is the infrasound, a frequency below 16 Hz, arriving first and alone. The audible bellow, the roar people associate with crocodiles, only follows a half-second later, almost an afterthought. The real message was already sent. That would be impressive enough on its own. The complication is that every male within earshot, or more accurately, within feel, receives the same signal at once, and infrasound does not lie about size. A crocodile's bellow pitch is governed by the length and mass of the vocal tract producing it, and there is no way to fake a longer throat. A 300-pound male trying to bluff a rival gets exposed the moment he opens his mouth, because his pitch simply cannot drop low enough. So within seconds of the first display, every competing male in the territory has already done the math on who is bigger, and at least one of them decides the math is close enough to challenge anyway. The second male surfaces 40 meters downriver and answers. His bellow is almost as deep, close enough that a fight is now the only way to settle who actually holds the water. What follows is not the theatrical headbutting of two stags. It is fast, ugly, and built to end quickly. The two males rush each other at the surface, jaws snapping for purchase on the neck or the base of the tail, powerful enough to tear through hide that can stop most other predators. Within 90 seconds, one male disengages, submerges, and does not resurface in that stretch of river again. He carries torn scutes down his flank as a permanent record of a fight he was never going to win. Size was never in question. The infrasound had already told everyone the answer. He simply refused to believe it until the water closed over his ribs. Victory does not end the performance, it escalates it. The dominant male now repeats the water dance every few minutes, and this time a female, drawn by a signal she has been feeling for days from a kilometer away, begins moving toward the sound rather than away from it. She approaches low in the water, only her eyes and the ridge of her back showing, and stops just outside striking range. For an animal capable of killing prey twice her size in under a second, this proximity is itself a risk. Crocodile courtship happens between two animals that are, by default, each other's most dangerous predator. Every gesture that follows exists to override that instinct for exactly long enough. He responds by lowering his head beneath the surface and blowing a stream of bubbles directly at her. A gesture that in any other context would look like aggression, and here functions as an invitation. She answers by rubbing the underside of her jaw against his snout, a deliberate, repeated contact that biologist C.P. Coffrin, who documented Nile crocodile courtship behavior across an entire breeding season on the Zambezi, recorded as the clearest predictor of which pairs would go on to mate. It looks almost tender. It is also a negotiation, because at any point in the next several minutes, either animal can decide the answer is no, and no is enforced with the same jaws that killed an impala the week before. The complication that follows is timing. Nile crocodiles do not simply pair off once and separate. Courtship here can stretch across days, with the same female circling territory held by 2 or 3 different bellowing males before settling. A rival male, drawn by the sound of the dominant pair's continued display, tests the boundary again on the second day, forcing a second confrontation while the female watches from a distance, apparently indifferent to which male survives the encounter. Her choice is not sentimental, it is auditory. She has already been listening to every male's infrasound for the better part of a week, and the fight is really just the final confirmation of data she collected without ever coming close enough to touch anyone. By the 3rd or 4th day, if the pairing holds, the two crocodiles begin submerging together for longer stretches, sometimes minutes at a time, surfacing only to breathe before sinking again, in what field researchers have described as a kind of synchronized drift. This is the closest the relationship gets to gentleness, and it is brief. Mating itself happens underwater, the male positioning himself alongside and slightly above the female, one foreleg braced across her back. The pairing lasting anywhere from a few seconds to just over a minute before the two animals separate and surface independently, often without any further contact between them. Timing itself is a complication most viewers never think to ask about. The infrasound display only works reliably when the water is calm enough to carry the pressure wave without interference, which means a display staged during a sudden storm or a fast-rising flood can simply fail to reach anyone, no matter how large or fit the male producing it is. Drought years compress the entire courtship window into a few precious weeks around the first rains, forcing dozens of males to bellow within days of each other instead of spreading the competition across a season, which multiplies the number of size mismatches that end in a fight rather than a retreat. A male who times his display wrong, even by a matter of days, can lose the entire breeding season to bad luck no amount of bulk or bellow depth could fix. The next complication arrives almost immediately, and it belongs entirely to the female. Within weeks, she needs a nest site, and on a crowded stretch of river, the good ground is already claimed by other females who mated days or even hours earlier.
She hauls out at night, testing the soil temperature and drainage with her snout before committing, because a nest dug too close to the waterline drowns in the first flood. and a nest dug too far inland cooks the eggs before they can hatch. Choosing wrong is not a small mistake. It can cost her an entire clutch of 40 or more eggs in a single bad decision. And she gets exactly one attempt per season to get it right. Once she starts digging, the danger shifts from courtship to defense. A finished nest advertises itself through disturbed earth and her own repeated visits, and Nile monitor lizards patrol riverbanks specifically watching for that pattern. A monitor that finds an unguarded nest can strip it of eggs within minutes, digging fast and retreating before the mother returns.
So she rarely leaves the nest unattended for long during the first days after laying, trading the energy she spent on courtship for weeks of exhausting, near-constant vigilance, baking in the sun beside a mound of sand for a return that will not arrive for close to 3 months. The male, meanwhile, is already gone. He does not guard the nest and plays no further role in raising the clutch. Freed from the pairing, he resumes bellowing within days, sometimes drawing a second female to a different stretch of the same territory before the first clutch has even finished incubating. It is a strategy built entirely around volume and signal strength, rather than sustained partnership, and it means the same infrasound pulse that won him a mate a week earlier is already being redeployed, unchanged, toward the next female listening from somewhere downriver. None of this should be physically possible for an animal built like a crocodile. A rigid, heavily armored ribcage evolved for crushing bite force and underwater ambush is not obvious equipment for producing a controlled subsonic pulse. The answer lies in the muscular architecture around the lungs themselves, which crocodilians can contract with extraordinary precision to compress air without releasing it through the throat, generating pressure waves through the body wall and into the water before any sound escapes the mouth. Physicist Roy Holt, who modeled the fluid dynamics of the display, found that the specific frequency produced causes the raised, ridged scutes running down a crocodilian's back to resonate in a pattern matching their own spacing, throwing water directly upward off the skin in what looks, on the surface, like something closer to magic than biology. The size cue embedded in that frequency is not a side effect either. It is the entire point. Sound production in any animal is bound by the physical dimensions of the structure producing it. The same reason a double bass cannot hit the notes of a violin, regardless of who is playing it. A crocodile's vocal tract and body cavity scale directly with its overall length, so the lowest frequency it can physically generate drops as the animal grows. There is no muscular trick, no learned technique that lets a smaller male fake the resonance of a larger one, which is precisely why the signal works as an honest broadcast of size across water too murky for any rival to actually see who is calling. The historical layer here runs deeper than most people expect.
Charles Darwin himself puzzled over crocodilian vocal behavior after reports from naturalists in the Nile basin described roaring during the wet season, but lacking any way to detect infrasound. 19th century observers could only record the audible bellow and speculate about its purpose, usually guessing territorial aggression and stopping there. It took until the late 20th century, with researcher Kent Fleet's detailed studies of American alligator displays, for scientists to understand that the visible water dance was not incidental to the bellow, but the primary signal, with the audible roar functioning almost as a byproduct. What 19th century naturalists heard as a warning turned out to be, at its core, a proposal. The myth that needs dismantling by this point should be obvious. Crocodiles are not the silent, purely instinctual killers of popular imagination, waiting motionless until prey wanders close enough to ambush.
Many people assume reptile courtship is a crude, mechanical event with no real signaling involved, no choice on the female side, nothing resembling communication. The infrasound water dance says otherwise. It is a precise, individually distinctive signal that broadcasts identity and size across distances no visual display could reach, murky water and all. And it gives the female real information she uses to make a real choice among several competing males. That is not mechanical instinct. That is negotiation conducted in a frequency human observers spent over a century failing to detect at all. A second, related myth deserves the same treatment. Reptiles are often described as animals that cannot really hear each other in any meaningful sense, cold-blooded machines running on smell and heat and little else. But crocodilians have inner ear structures sensitive enough to register infrasound at ranges that dwarf their visual field. And juvenile crocodiles inside unhatched eggs can detect and respond to sound days before they break through the shell, calling back and forth to synchronize hatching within a single nest. An animal capable of coordinating birth through sound before it has even seen daylight is not the mute, purely reactive creature the popular image insists on. It is running an acoustic world most observers on the riverbank never suspect exists. There is a final complication worth sitting with, because it explains why this signal evolved to be so extreme in the first place. Nile crocodile habitat is often turbid, current-driven, and visually chaotic, water thick with silt where a visual display would vanish within a few meters. Sound does not have that problem. And infrasound in particular travels through water with almost no loss over distance, cutting straight through murk, reed beds, and current in a way no color or posture ever could. The bellow evolved to solve a problem specific to being a large, solitary predator that needs to advertise across a landscape it cannot see across. It is a mating call, built for exactly the kind of environment that makes every other form of courtship display useless. Not every encounter ends in success, and the cost of failure is not small. A male who bellows through an entire season without drawing a mate has spent enormous energy reserves he built up over months of near-total stillness. Weight he may not recover before the dry season tightens food supplies again. A male who wins a female but loses a late challenge from a larger rival can carry wounds that become infected in warm, bacteria-dense water. Wounds that occasionally prove fatal weeks after the fight itself ended. The water dance is not a low-stakes performance. It is closer to a public declaration that can be verified, contested, and punished, all in the same stretch of river. How deeply this signal is wired into crocodilian breeding biology became clear almost by accident on a farm in Queensland, where researcher Cameron Baker and colleagues at Charles Darwin University documented saltwater crocodiles responding with sudden mating activity to the low-frequency thump of passing helicopter rotors. The animals had no way of knowing the sound came from a machine. To a body tuned for weeks to detect exactly one kind of low-frequency pulse in water, the distinction did not matter.
Any signal in the right register reads as an invitation or a challenge, whether it comes from a rival's lungs or 8 tons of aircraft passing overhead. Right now, as the wet season builds across the Nile basin and along waterways from the Zambezi to the Okavango, this same performance is happening in dozens of separate territories at once, invisible and inaudible to anyone standing on the bank. Tourists photograph the roar and never notice the water jumping half a second earlier, never realize the actual message was already sent and received before the sound reached their ears at all. What looks, from land, like an animal simply roaring at the sky is in fact the most honest advertisement in the animal kingdom. A signal that cannot be faked, cannot be muted, and cannot be understood by the one species standing close enough to watch it, and still, after all this time, only ever hearing half of it.